This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On November the 3rd, the Museum of the Institute held its second annual Military History Symposium, entitled The End of the Great War, The Canadian Perspective. Our second speaker was the curator of the RCMI Museum, Mr. Ryan Goldsworthy.
For that fine introduction, and once again thank you all for attending today. Indeed, my talk this afternoon, as a follow-up to Jack's, is a little more military history directed. My talk itself, I'll be basically breaking it down into three parts. The first, I'll be talking about Canada's 100 Days, sort of what led to it, the context leading up to it, and then I'm going to end sort of talking about memory and how we sort of memorialize these many casualties that the 100 Days created in that 3-month period. So before I start my lecture this afternoon, I wanted to start with a quote from Will R. Byrd. So Byrd was an enlisted man from the 42nd Battalion who served from Vimy basically all the way to the end of the war, including all of the battles of the 100 Days offensive. He actually won the military medal on the second last day of the war at Mons, Belgium. Byrd was a prolific writer, and among other works, he produced perhaps the single greatest Canadian memoir of the First World War, And We Go On. For those of you who haven't read it or haven't heard of it, it's highly recommended. He actually published a second edition in 1968, which is more famously known as Ghosts Have Warm Hands, which you probably have heard of. The quote itself: within 20 years, the veterans will have gone to their last roll call. Then they can bury forever, with the spiders and stale tobacco, everything regarding the Great War. It will then be of no interest to existing generations. Though Byrd was writing in the 1930s on his frustrations on the lack of an official history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, his still relevant warning compels us to consider the importance of history, memory, and meaning. With the last Canadian veteran of the Great War, John Babcock, passing in 2010, there are no living links remaining to that conflict. But we are now at the end of the centenary of the Great War, occasion which has revitalized awareness on Great War history. We must continue to promote its history as the event passes even further into time. It is events such as our symposium today, the continued exhibitions of our museum, and the many events throughout the past 4 centennial years I'm sure many of you have attended, which continue to ensure that this history is not buried with the spiders and the stale tobacco. So as I mentioned on the outset, I'm going to sort of divide my lecture down to 3, but I've sort of pointed it out so you kind of know where I'm going to be in order of the content. So I'm going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. And I can't just talk about the 100 Days in isolation, of course. It's really about how the Canadian Corps developed to that point, sort of what led to the 100 Days, which was the German Spring Offensive. And I'm going to talk about the 100 Days itself, which is one of my specialties. And then sort of talk about the casualties and post-war, sort of how Canada's tried to reconcile those losses with the purpose of the war itself. And I'm going to touch a little bit on how we sort of remembered the war in the centennial and why the war still matters to us today. So before my analysis on Canada's 100 Days, I found it imperative to say a few words on how Canada's fighting forces evolved throughout the war years. In 1914, Canada was a small nation of approximately 8 million people. It was still largely agrarian, and Confederation had taken place less than 50 years before the war had begun. By 1914, Canada did not have a standing army, but its fighting forces were comprised primarily of militiamen. There were very few professional soldiers and even fewer career soldiers. In short, Canada was woefully unprepared for a world war, and similar to the other allies, it had absolutely no idea of the scale of death and destruction which was to come. Naturally, as the old narrative has been well established, Canada's enthusiasm to participate in this great European war and support the British Empire was incredibly high. All current issues, from local politics to imperial affairs, were swept aside, and the sense of patriotism filled almost every Canadian from all walks of life. As historians Margaret Conrad and James Hiller wrote, apart from a few eccentrics, almost everybody, workers, employers, Acadians, blacks, Catholics, Protestants, liberals, conservatives, men and women, all supported the Empire in its struggle against the Germans. When the 1st Canadian Division arrived in Flanders in the spring of 1915, it was not the legendary war-winning formation that it would become. Indeed, the Canadian experienced a profound learning curve in 1915 and 1916, sustaining high casualty rates, including 24,000 alone in the summer of 1916 at the Somme, and little battlefield success. Though these costly offensives from Ypres to the Somme achieved little, the Canadians began a concerted and institutionalized effort to learn from these failures and apply the lessons learned in set-piece battles. Just to give you some context on what a set-piece battle is, I mean, we see this term a lot in the literature. But in the First World War, it meant it was a deliberate attack that was planned and organized, strictly scheduled in advance, and then executed according to design under the cover of a rolling artillery barrage. So 1917 was the turning point in the development of the Canadian Corps. As Jack mentioned, the Allies were not doing well in that time. This is when the Canadians really learned their craft. Indeed, I say this with great conviction. The Canadians were the only formation on their Western Front never to lose a battle in the final 2 years of the war, which is a remarkable achievement. It was at Vimy in particular where Canada would prove the success of its style of offensive and corps structure. Advances in ingenuity on infantry tactics, planning and preparation, leadership, and especially in the application of artillery, led to the success of Vimy in a mere 4 days. In terms of leadership, the Canadians separated themselves from their imperial allies through a complete overhaul of the promotional process of the Corps. The Canadian Corps commander of Vimy, Julian Byng, insisted on promoting and removing officers based on merit alone. As Byng defiantly stated in the lead-up to Vimy, if the credit of the Corps is to be augmented, the men must be led by leaders. I want the Canadians who have proved their worth. This revolutionary motion to prioritize merit above patronage is in the promotional system ensured that the leadership of the Corps would not consist of inept men of privilege, but of individuals who possessed military acumen, had proven their abilities in combat, and were therefore best qualified to lead their men into battle. Under Byng, 40 of the 49 infantry battalion commanders, 6 of the 12 brigadiers, and 84 of the 118 senior command or staff appointments had taken their positions before Vimy. Many of these men would remain in their positions through to the end of the war. Arthur Currie himself stands behind me here. Byng's most trusted officer, the future commander of the Canadian Corps, and arguably the ablest general of the First World War on either side, was a failed real estate operator, close to bankruptcy. He had very limited professional military experience prior to 1914. As Jack mentioned, he had stolen 5 figures from his regiment. In the British Army, someone of Currie's background would not have risen past the field rank, where education and breeding counted for more than military skills. Currie's brilliance was recognized and rewarded in the Canadian Corps, and so too were the capabilities of countless other Canadian officers. One of my favorite quotes from Tim Cook on this, he says, "Canadian High Command was far from the ossified docky generals of literature." Of course, it wasn't the officers alone who were overhauled at Vimy, but the other ranks too were educated and empowered in their roles. At Vimy, 40,000 detailed maps and aerial photography were disseminated to all soldiers of the Canadian Corps, and the men therefore knew the terrain, the direction and their objectives before the battle began. This practice of more operational learned soldiers was relatively revolutionary to that point in the First World War. In the offensives prior to Vimy, most soldiers were given very few details regarding the battlefield or their objectives. The generalship had a virtual monopoly on information, and men were to rely on the leadership and guidance of company officers as the battle unfolded. This heavy reliance on officers often resulted in failure because when the officers were killed or incapacitated, troops would lose direction and the attack was either halted or decimated. With the proper training of all ranks in the lead up to Vimy, in the event that an officer fell, the other ranks were informed on where to maneuver on the field and what objectives needed to be accomplished. Though Vimy, of course, did not directly result in the victory of the First World War, its most impactful tactical legacy was that it provided the Canadians with an archetype model on how to plan and execute a set-piece attack. Indeed, in future operations, Arthur Currie elected for the set-piece attacking style, which had proven effective at Vimy. Canadians would follow up their victory at Vimy in 1917 with major victories at both Hill 70 and at Passchendaele at the end of the year. High casualties in these campaigns, coupled with the low enlistment rates in Canada, however, resulted in the implementation of conscription. As Jack explained at last year's symposium, the conscription of 1917 has been much maligned for its domestic issues, but the influx of men in time for Canada's 100 days proved to be a resounding tactical success. The Australian Corps, in comparison, who had taken similarly large casualties to the Canadians at Amiens on the 8th of August 1918, which was the opening battle of the 100 Days. They had actually voted down conscription in Australia, and they were therefore unable to replenish their corps as the Canadians did, which really sapped a lot of their corps' fighting capabilities in the final 3 months of the war. Throughout my career, I have found, despite the importance of the 100 Days in bringing the war to a victorious close, the offensive has curiously not received the same level of popular recognition as Ypres, Vimy, or even Passchendaele. Since completing my own master's thesis on the topic years ago, I have written and spoken widely on the importance of this campaign and on Canada's role in it. Indeed, and I say this with absolute conviction, there was no single formation that was more influential than the Canadian Corps in bringing the war to a victorious close in 1918. The Canadian Corps served as both the spearhead and the elite shock army of this final and decisive Allied campaign of the war. The 100 Days Offensive resulted in a complete Allied victory, the armistice, and the unconditional surrender of Germany. During the 100 days, waged between the 8th of August 1918 and the 11th of November 1918, the Canadian Corps never lost a battle. They advanced 86 miles, liberated 500 square miles of territory, 228 cities, towns, and villages, captured over 31,000 German prisoners, 623 guns, 2,800 machine guns, and defeated roughly 1/4 of the German army. Not bad for a corps about the size of 100,000. Now, just to sort of give you a sense of those movements, because often we read about numbers, they advanced 86 miles. Well, what does this really mean? How far is that? So on the graph here, we have the back line, sort of where, just beyond Amiens there, where they started. And basically they moved that whole front forward, past where you see the red line that runs through Mons there. Now that movement, just to put that into perspective. So at the Somme in the summer of 1916, the Allies moved a total of 8 miles over 5 months and 6-figure casualties, where the Canadians moved 86 miles in 3 months, cracking down some of the most impenetrable German positions in this time. This 86 miles represents a further distance than all the other Allied campaigns combined. So while the First World War is often seen as the static stalemate, where men are stuck in the trenches, going over the top, or fruitless offensives, this was anything but. This was a rapid offensive meant to end the war as quickly as possible, and that's exactly what happened. So before I get into some of the specifics as to why the Canadians were so wildly successful in the final months of the war, we must first look briefly at the penultimate offensive of the war, the German Spring Offensive. In March 1918, with the closure of the Eastern Front, the American Expeditionary Force mobilized, and Germany at the cusp of starvation through the British naval blockade. The German High Command attempted one final roll of the dice to win the war. Germany aimed to break the British lines, which, so they hoped, would subsequently result in France suing for peace. Suffice to say, Germany has never had a very high opinion of France. Though the German offensive advanced further than either side had to that point, experiencing tremendous tactical victories and closing in on Paris, which created a lot of chaos in the Allied leadership. They were ultimately halted at the Second Battle of the Marne in July 1918. Now, other than the failed Schlieffen Plan, which opened the Western Front in 1914, this was the closest that Germany would come to winning the war. The Germans were closer to winning the war in this time than many of us would like to concede. Several prime ministers, including the very vocal Prime Minister of South Africa, Louis Botha, advocated for peace with Germany at this time. They thought it would be best to cut a good deal before the Germans took Paris. Now, contributing to this ultimate halt of the German offensive, and this is sort of the Canadian connection to this, is the Canadian Corps wasn't directly involved in halting the Germans during the Spring Offensive, which actually played into their favor during the 100 Days. But the Canadian connection to this is the last cavalry charge in history, which was led by Canadian Lieutenant Gordon Flowerdew, who's actually at the front of this portrait here. This is in the holdings of the Canadian War Museum, very valuable portrait. So on March 30th, 1918, as the Germans were coming in on their advance, they determined that they saw this opportunity. It was almost this vision that otherwise it should have failed. It was a cavalry charge in 1918 when the cavalry had almost been phased out of warfare at that point. But they saw this opportunity to attack the German lines, and that's exactly what they did. So Flowerdew took his entire squadron, Moriel Wood, and they crossed over, swords drawn, just like the portrait shows, broke the two German lines, halted the offensive right there. Now, when I say this is my professional opinion, this is one of the moments that altered the course of history. Had they not taken this charge right at this moment, the Germans very well may have been able to advance, and the Allies may have had to sue for peace. But this cavalry charge, the last in history, even though they took 70% casualty rates when they ran in over the German machine guns, they were actually effective in stopping the Germans right then and there. As for Flowerdew, he actually earned a VC posthumously, which is in England, unfortunately, but hopefully it'll be repatriated to Canada someday. So once the German offensive was officially called off in July 1918, the Allies instigated the counter-offensive, the 100 Days. The offensive was initially launched to retake ground lost to Germany throughout the spring, but it could quickly evolve into the breakthrough that the Allied generals had yearned for since 1914. Though the Canadian Corps escaped relatively unscathed, as I mentioned, by the German offensive, by early 1918, the Corps was plagued by a state of administrative turmoil and uncertainty. They were not then the unified and cohesive formation of VIMI that you may imagine. In those early months of 1918, the Canadian government wished to impose a 5th Canadian Division upon the Corps, under the command of the very incompetent Garnet Hughes, who was the son of Sir Sam Hughes. The British Expeditionary Force desired a reorganization of the Corps, both for political effect and to mirror British organization. And the 4 Canadian divisions were not fighting together on the front. British command also aimed to integrate American battalions, if you can believe it, into the depleted corps, which Currie predicted would be a complete disaster and would destroy strong feelings of esprit de corps and comradeship. Currie, quite naturally, was opposed to any measure which was not, quote, in the best interests of Canada's fighting forces. Ultimately, Currie, with the aid of the Overseas Ministry, which afforded him with the autonomy and the support to achieve his goals, prevailed against all of these proposed changes and kept the Canadian Corps fighting together for the entire 100 days offensive. And in turn, keeping both the proven formations and its esprit de corps intact. Currie insisted that there was a direct correlation between tactical efficiency and unit organization, and organizational changes could just as easily impede rather than improve battlefield success. Among others, including myself, Currie's view is supported by Des Morton, who contends that because of the tactics and circumstances of 1918, Currie's insistence upon maintaining the structure of the Corps made his formation much more powerful in the final offensive of the war. The Corps benefited greatly from Currie's effort to keep together, fighting together, working together, and he ensured that the divisions and brigades learned from each other's successes and failures. Currie was also able to keep the Corps relatively independent from British command, and he instilled a sense of national Canadian identity within it, to the point where, regardless of whether or not the personnel were British born, the war, quote, turned them into Canadians. Following the Spring Offensive, which had cost the British Expeditionary Force massive casualties, Douglas Haig emotionally remarked, "In all the dark days of the spring, God knows they were dark enough, one comforting thought came to me, that I still had the Canadian Corps unused and fresh. I felt that I could not be defeated until the Corps had been in action." The outcome of the 100 days in achieving ultimate victory in 1918 would be tied directly to the success of the Canadian Corps. During the 100 days, Canada achieved exceptional breakthroughs in the rapid movements at Amiens onward through their employment of combined arms operations. While combined arms, or the cooperative work of multiple arms attacking in unison, may today seem standard from our modern perspective, in 1918 it was revolutionary. Coordinating men, tanks, aircraft, artillery, and machine guns en masse was no easy task. Indeed, as thousands of infantry moved forward with bullets, bayonets, and bombs, the artillery was simultaneously responsible for protecting them through a steady, creeping barrage and the neutralization of German batteries. Now, nearly 70% of all casualties in the First World War were caused by the artillery, so it was essential to any operation. You had to neutralize the artillery, otherwise the infantry just simply could not get across the field. On top of this, hundreds of tanks and armored cars wielding Vickers machine guns shielded and supported the infantry and crushed out remaining pockets of barbed wire and German resistance. The Royal Air Force, meanwhile, attacked resilient ground targets, covered the noise of the tanks moving into position, and provided updated intelligence on the battlefield. The use of combined arms, specifically with the successful integration of the armor, was proven by the Australian Corps at the Battle of Hamel in July of 1918. In fact, British Army Commander Henry Rawlinson viewed the attack by the Australians at Hamel as a good trial run for Amiens. Rawlinson would then request that the Canadian Corps spearhead the attack at Amiens on the 8th of August. Haig agreed based on both the reputation of the Canadian Corps and because of the Corps' sheer combat power. Behind an armada of tanks, planes, and a rolling artillery barrage coordinated by Canadian Counter-Battery Staff Officer Andrew McNaught, the Canadian Infantry Battalions delivered the single most decisive day for the Allies in the entire war on the 8th of August. At Amiens, for the first time in history, Army commanders controlled air squadrons from the ground. The infantry was able to exploit the advances of the tanks and the decimation of the German defensive by the Canadian field artillery. WHS Macklin of the 19th Battalion wrote on the initial advance at Amiens, "The shells came over our heads with an appalling shriek in the fog ahead. We simply lit our cigarettes, shouldered our rifles, and walked off after the shells. This is what we did until we reached the objective." The results of the proper application of combined arms were stunning. On the opening day of Amiens, the Canadians, under the cover of their guns, had aggressively advanced 13 kilometers, capturing all three of their major objectives and routing the German army. General Ludendorff infamously decried that the 8th of August was the black day of the German army. Following Amiens, Canada continued to roll through the Western Front, breaking down some of the most seemingly impenetrable German defensive networks, including both the vaunted Hindenburg and DQ lines. The Canadians successfully crossed the Canal du Nord on the 27th of September 1918, in one of the most daring operations of the war. In this operation, and under the cover of darkness, the Canadian Corps concentrated their entire corps on a series of narrow bridges constructed by the Canadian engineers in order to cross an unfinished canal. I spoke on the artillery last year, so I won't go too long on this. But had the Germans just simply known the Canadians were going to cross at that point, or had they been just random chance shot their artillery at these bridges, it would have wiped out the Canadian Corps right then and there. Days later, after crossing the canal, Canada had captured the Germans' nexus in France, Cambrai. Following the capture of Cambrai, Canada continued to rapidly liberate territory through occupied France and Belgium. And simultaneously, they saw firsthand the cruelty and the martial law of the Germans and their Prussian militarism. The Canadian advance culminated in the capture of Valenciennes on the 2nd November through a legendary and overwhelming artillery bombardment, where the Corps only used a single infantry brigade, or about 1,200 men, against triple the number of German defenders. Canadian artillery was so powerful at Valenciennes. One German company commander lamented that because of the intensity of this multi-directional Canadian bombardment, quote, "it was impossible to see or even know which direction the attackers were coming." The attack at Valenciennes was in fact so successful that it was the type of operation that the Allies would have attempted into 1919 had the war continued. In fact, the photo that I've selected here is quite rare in that it's actually one of the very few photographs which shows the Canadian Corps in combat. It's also rare because this is one of the very few battles throughout the war that was actually fought in an urban environment. So to have both this urban warfare and the Canadian Corps, running into combat is a very rare photograph, and this was taken on the 2nd of November, just outside of Valenciennes. The 100 days ended with the Canadians' capture of Mons, Belgium on November 11th, 1918. Mons, of course, was where the Great War had begun for the British Expeditionary Force, and after 50 months of German occupation, so too was where it ended. Tragically, Canadian Private George Price of the 28th Battalion died only 2 minutes before the armistice officially took place at 10:58 a.m. Mons was a great symbolic victory for the Allies. Arthur Curry's reputation would be very unfairly damaged in the ensuing controversy of having attacked a city with the war so close to the end. Historian Hugh Brewster will speak more to this in his talk this afternoon. The offensive was also renowned for the number of individual acts of courage by Canadians. Nearly half of all of Canada's 73 First World War Victoria Crosses were won in these last 3 months of the war. 1918 saw the Canadian Corps at its best. 100 days is the single greatest and most influential battle achievement in Canada's military history. What Jack Granatstein calls, quote, "the most important Canadian role in battle ever. The only time that this nation's military contribution might truly be called decisive." Canada effectively won the war in this climactic campaign. The price was steep, at over 45,835 casualties in a mere 3 months. The immortal words of Arthur Currie, "You cannot meet and defeat in battle 1/4 of the German army without sustaining casualties." This sort of gets off into the last major part of my talk, which is reconciling these losses and memorializing Canada's war effort in the years which followed. In particular, it's the extent of these 45,000 casualties and the magnitude of Canada's overall sacrifice in the Great War, which dominated popular remembrance in the past century. Indeed, Canada sustained more casualties and war dead in the Great War than in all of its other conflicts combined. And reconciling this loss with the purpose of the war was one of the earliest and most enduring contentions in remembering and memorializing the war. These casualty numbers are exacerbated further when we recall that Canada of 1914 had approximately 8 million people and sustained over 220,000 total casualties in the First World War. If we put those numbers in today's context, in a nation of about 35 million people, we're looking at about 1 million casualties. I don't like to downplay anything, but when you compare the fact that we had about 150 military deaths in Afghanistan, we're talking about 66,000 war dead in a period when we had only 8 million people in this country. It's unthinkable. It's unsustainable in the long term. The big question becomes, how would a young nation respond to this? The portrait I have here is actually by Frederick Varley, who was a Group of 7 artist, later Group of 7 artist, and he was an official war artist from Canada. He remarked on the war, and he actually did visit the front, which actually influenced many of his paintings. He remarked, "We'd be healthier to forget the war, that we never can. We are forever tainted with its abortiveness and its cruel drama." Obviously, Varley was greatly disturbed by what he saw on the Western Front, and these feelings are clearly reflected in his artwork. This artwork I put up here, entitled "For What?", completed in 1918, was quite controversial at the time. You can see here in this cart all the uninterred Canadians slumped and piled ingloriously onto this cart, waiting to be buried into the crater scarred and muddy wet fields of Flanders. Work like this was not celebrated by the wider public in its time, for obvious reasons. Though this negativity towards Canada's participation in the Great War was not a popular perception across Canada, the seeds of separatism and disunity had been sown in Quebec. What was seen as a careless exercise in Canadian lives, and even outside of French Canada, as the casualties mounted, the previously marginalized pacifist and anti-war movements in Canada began to find wider acceptance and substantial growth. Remembering by regular Canadians, however, would take many different forms. Now, one popular method in communities I'm sure you're all familiar with across Canada was to simply name things after the war. In fact, this was such a common practice that you would seldom go anywhere in Canada that had seen some stark reminder of the Great War. New settlements were established at the time, including the Somme, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, Vimy, Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta. Mountains in the Canadian Rockies were named after Arras, Cambrai, and several Canadian BC winners. Battle-class trawlers, Legion branches, halls, community centers, university campuses, and even children were named after Canadian Great War heroes. Churches installed stained glass windows and prominent plaques that attempted to commemorate the members of the congregation that served and not come home. Daily memory was embedded into the very fabric of Canada. Memorializing the war, however, would also require a much greater communal participation in adopting the name of a battle or a war hero. Perhaps the most striking and enduring physical form of remembrance are the cenotaphs and memorial plaques that were erected across the country, most of which still stand to this day. Across Canada, even the smallest of communities erected monuments to those men who did not survive the war. This one I've displayed here is actually from Lethbridge, Alberta. And even on this side of the column, you can see hundreds of names written down. This was not a large community. It wasn't then and it isn't now. I used to live in Alberta, and I went through Canmore, which is basically on the road to Banff. It's basically a small resort town now, but even the Legion there has a couple dozen names on the side of the building. You just start to think what this did to the community. This whole generation of young men just did not come home. Wherever you go in Canada today, regardless of the size of the town, permitting it existed in 1918, there is some reminder, some personal story related to the First World War. I would say that these personal and intimate stories of loss and commemoration very much unified our young nation in a time of tremendous common grief. In fact, even though we're 100 years on, one of the best parts of being a curator of the RCMI are the personal stories that people share with me when I'm giving them tours. The grandfather, great-grandfather, father served in the First or Second World War. We still have this familial connection to it. This was an army of volunteers. This is why we have these connections. In erecting cenotaphs, there was great debate at the time as to what exactly should be erected. Should they all be uniform or distinct? Should the focus be communal or national? And Sam Hughes even suggested that the height of each community's cenotaph should be determined based on the number of casualties that respective community had. Not the best idea. Naturally, any attempts to centralize control of this memorialization was rightfully and roundly rejected. This was a local, personal experience, and this is what we see. Ultimately, these cenotaphs and permanent monuments erected across the country were not necessarily artistic or architectural marvels. They didn't need to be. They were intended to express the feelings of local communities towards the war they were attempting to commemorate. The French art critic at the time, in post-war Canada, Michael Ragon, remarked further about these Great War cenotaphs, writing, "Through the creation of jobbing workmen, they have been transformed into popular sculptures corresponding to the majority taste of the population. They also express a taste for the melodrama, a fine gesture, a body song. There is a certain old-fashioned vulgarity about them that betrays plebeian, petty bourgeoisie origin." These monuments serve as a testament of not only the community's contribution to the war, but as an everlasting reminder of the stalwart and young individuals of the community did not return intact. Of course, the largest and most significant memorial project in the post-war was the construction and unveiling of the National Vimy Monument in 1936. I could deliver an entire lecture on this alone, but I'll just say a few points on why it matters. The Vimy Monument, with its towering twin pylons, is adorned with the names of 11,285 Canadians who died in France during the Great War but have no known grave. The memorial was officially unveiled by King Edward VIII on the 26th of July, 1936. Its unveiling was well attended by over 50,000 people, including 6,200 Canadian veterans and their families. You have to remember, this was in an era before the time of non-stop flights, from Pearson to Charles de Gaulle. This was an effort to get to this site. This meant a lot to these people. The unveiling in 1936 was described as a Canadian pilgrimage. And those Canadian veterans who attended were awarded with the 1936 Vimy Pilgrimage Medal. On a side note, there's actually a copy of the Vimy Pilgrimage Medal and several event ephemera on the third floor on display at the RCMI. The land where the monument was built was gifted to the Canadian people to be used freely and for all time. Freely and for all time. I want to emphasize how important it was that this greatest Canadian war monument was not built in Canada, but rather on the fields that its sons had fought and died. Vimy remains only one of two national parks outside of Canada, the other being Beaumont-Hamel, where the Newfoundlanders faced their crucible on the first day of the Somme. The intimate connection forged between the soldier and Canada gave the war a special place in the Canadian consciousness. The Canadian Expeditionary Force had been the soul of the nation transported overseas. This is an excerpt out of Jonathan Vance's very fine work, Memory Meeting in the First World War. I would contend that the Vimy Monument is the physical iteration of this soul of the nation transported overseas that Jonathan Vance was speaking of. In erecting this monument, Canada left this piece of itself in France and Flanders. The Vimy Monument stands for more than just the Canadians missing in France. It has come to represent all of those Canadians who fought and died in the Great War. It has also become the quintessential Canadian pilgrimage, a site unlike any other. The largest gathering of people at the Vimy Memorial since the unveiling in 1936 occurred on the 9th of April 2017, 100 years to the date of the men of the Canadian Corps stormed the ridge. On this occasion, approximately 30,000 Canadians, 12,000 of them students, attended the commemoration. As the museum curator of the RCMI, I was fortunate enough to be in attendance for this remarkable event. Almost invariably, each Canadian at Vimy at this ceremony traveled quite far and had spent a great deal of time and money to ensure their attendance. There is no question of how important this event was to so many, including the millions of Canadians watching at home. The largest single contingent of Canadians at this ceremony were the groups of high school students, most of whom are easily identifiable by their bright red or white windbreakers, for those of you who were there. Considering the Canadian Corps was comprised primarily of teenagers and young adults, it was a very fitting tribute to have such a strong youth movement at Vimy. Indeed, there was a very overt message within the ceremony that the metaphorical torch of remembrance had been passed. There are no Great War veterans still alive. It was very clearly up to us, those who have no living memory of the conflict, to remember the importance of the Canadian sacrifice in the war. The ceremony opened with a powerful rendition of O Canada, and the 30,000 Canadian attendees joining in unison to sing the anthem. This distant battlefield was a moment of true patriot love that simply just can't be put into words. Beyond the Vimy Centennial, organizations, museums, local and federal governments, and countless individuals have held and attended events over the past few years commemorating Canada's role in the war. These past 4 years of centennial events, ceremonies, speeches, exhibitions, articles, performances, art, and private contemplations have shown us anything. It's that one whole century later, the Great War still has meaning to Canadians, and I believe that it always will. While the round number of 100 will almost ensure that the ceremonies of these past several years will be the most pomp and well attended, Canadians will continue to take great pride in their history. We should not and cannot allow our military history to ebb away once it is outside of the centennial limelight. The city of Mons, Belgium. There's a plaque inside the entrance to the old city hall that reads, Mons was recaptured by the Canadian Corps on the 11th of November 1918. After 50 months of German occupation, freedom was restored to the city. Here was fired the last shots of the Great War. Fittingly, at the end of the final offensive of the war, in the city where the war had begun for the British Empire, the Canadian Corps had victoriously concluded it. Indeed, in these last 3 months of the Great War, the Canadian Expeditionary Force defeated the most powerful land army in Europe. While the 100 Days was the greatest military achievement and victory in our nation's history, the cost was immense. This cost of human life, the ensuing national grief, and an effort to memorialize Canada's war dead across the nation dominated the very fabric of post-war Canada. After the war, Canada had earned a seat at the League of Nations. Under Britain, they were a signee of the Treaty of Versailles. They had forged a more independent place on the world stage. Perhaps most importantly, they had become more directly responsible for their own citizens. Never again would Canada be committed to a war that it had not itself decided to participate in. Today, the history of the Great War still matters, irrespective of the centennial. The Great War is still felt, though we no longer have the living connection to the conflict we share in its history as Canadians. I'm going to end my lecture with a quote. It was actually published on the first Armistice Day on November 11th, 1919, appearing in the Globe. The world is full of anxieties and perplexities. The reactions of war have left many problems. It would not be a terrible and fearful world if the struggle were still going on. By this time, every nation would be involved in the loss of life. Universal suffering would be beyond all imagining. For those who died, that the world might be saved, the living owe a debt they can never repay. Let them remind themselves of it by paying homage today to the known and the unknown whose lives were sacrificed on the altar of freedom. Thank you.
Canadians today are justifiably very proud of the achievement of the Canadian Corps in the last 100 days. I've read that at the time there were many soldiers in the Canadian Corps who resented the fact that they were the ones who were called upon to initiate the charge again and again and again. And they felt that they were expected to carry more than their fair share of the load in the last 100 days. And so I'm wondering just whether that belief was justified. Where were the British? Where were the French during this time? Was Canada, in fact, being taken advantage of, perhaps, during this time?
Sure, thanks for your question. To answer your first question, I would say certainly it's understood and justified. I mean, these were the men in the trenches walking across these fields. They can't necessarily see the big picture. They don't know the operational objectives, the strategic level objectives. All they see is that, their friends are suffering and dying in these last few months of the war, and they are being called. You could argue that it was unfair, but the fact is that Douglas Haig, his position was in jeopardy. With every British casualty, more and more steam was mounting for his removal as the commander of the British Expeditionary Force. Now, he saw the Canadians as twofold. One, he knew that they always delivered. As I mentioned, they were the only formation in the war never to lose a battle in the last 2 years. Absolutely, he was using the Canadians because he knew that they could get the job done. Secondly, and this may sound more harsh, but it's true, he saw Canadian casualties as less of a political liability to his continued military career than a British casualty. So yes, if you look at the Canadian Corps, it's only about 100,000 strong. 45,000 casualties in 3 months. That's almost half of the entire Corps in a 3-month period. That's unsustainable. So I've thought about Haig's long-term goal. And while I look at it as he saw the Canadian Corps not as a resource to be squandered, but one that he just heavily relied on because it was the only one that he could rely on in the end. The Australian Corps was great as well, but as I mentioned, because they didn't have conscription, they couldn't replenish their corps. They needed more time. Canadians were able to keep rolling for that reason. Now, the Americans weren't fully mobilized at that point. They were still started learning the Western Front. They were new to the game. It fell to Canada and the Commonwealth to really win this war and win this war right now. So the feelings of the soldiers certainly justifiable. That's what they're seeing on the ground. But if you look at the big picture, Canada had to get the job done, and that's what they did. So if that answers your question.
Forgive my ignorance, but how many corps did the British have available to them at the time of the 100 days?
I'm trying to remember exactly how many corps. Five, yeah. There was 5 armies and there were several corps within each army. So you may be asking, why did the British send many of their corps to the front? Well, I'll say this. How one British historian described it was that basically this was an Allied thrust. So you have, basically it's an analogy of a sword, whereas the Canadian and the Commonwealth are the tip of the sword, the British Expeditionary Force is the blade, kind of supporting us. It wasn't the Canadians alone in the 100 days. We were the spearhead, but we were supported by these British corps and armies.
I'm going to take a second question, or take advantage of the opportunity. So from the perspective of a Canadian soldier, who survived the 100 days, aside from a seat at the League of Nations, what did Canada get out of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the most, like besides that stuff, besides, you know, you can argue all these big picture things, like, oh, it gave us more independent place on the world stage, but I think more importantly was that from then on, Canada was directly responsible for its citizens and the lives of its citizens. If you look even to the World War II, we participated because we decided to. It wasn't that, you know, the British Empire is at war, now so are we. Let's, you know, blow the bugles and bang the drums. Canada is responsible for its citizens. And as I mentioned, we were never involved in another war that we, like Canada, like our House of Commons did decide to participate on our own. And I think if nothing else, that's a pretty important development, that we were not going to be subjected to any more imperial wars. We were not just simply under the thumb of the British Empire. We were going to be in charge of our own military and what our contribution was going to be going forward.
100 years later and several generations later, we live in different times, obviously. One of the things that's often bemused me is what exactly was behind the thinking of the average soldier on either side of the lines walking to their deaths. And I don't know if you've read Modus Extreme's book about the rites of spring, but it certainly answers some of the questions for me in terms of, you know, what drove these people to actually do this. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think every answer is as varied as the individual, their personal reasons for going to war. I think from what I've read, the letters, the books, there's a great book called When Your Number's Up by Des Morton that sort of addresses this topic. I think what it came down to was sort of a commitment to their comrades. That if they were going to see this through, it was going to be because of the guy beside them that they had served with, trained with. That nationalistic stuff, I think it goes away relatively quickly. I think a lot of soldiers start to question. It's easy to sign up when you're, you know, caught up in the great fervor of war and serving the nation and the empire. When you're actually sitting in the trenches, rotting away, and you're seeing your friends die, those motivations start to change. And I think it became about, every memoir I've read is about sort of a commitment to the men you're serving with, and just getting through this. And it was a different time. We could never have a war of this kind again. It's an anachronism in a lot of ways. You can imagine the riots in the streets if we were, you know, sustaining 4 or 5, you know, figure casualty rates. It just wouldn't happen. So it's hard to just kind of paint a wide brush in terms of what soldiers were thinking and why they went to war. But that was probably the most compelling, I think, over time, once they were in it for a few months, was serving with the men, seeing this job completed. And I think a lot of the Canadians did take pride. A lot of them did resent the role, being the spearhead and being called upon every time after Passchendaele. But the truth was, I did think some did take some pride. If you read a lot of the quotes, a lot of them do say, you know what, it fell to the Canadians to take care of this again. The British couldn't do it, the French couldn't do it, it was us. So I think there is a bit of pride, but also sort of commitment to their fellow guys. So that would be my answer.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to thank you and Mr. Granatstein and the various people who have written about the last 100 days. I have just recently been really looking again at the military records of my dear old uncle, who was sort of a surrogate father to me in my youth. He wouldn't talk much about all this stuff, but it turns out that he was a signaler with the 1st Division during the 100 days. I even have the little compasses he used to keep track of when he was out trying to repair wires and so on. But anyway, the other point I would make is, in response to my previous speaker, anybody here who has gone through basic training, as I did 65 years ago, the more I think back on it, the more I think that basic training is just that, to train you, to learn, to look after your buddies. And it was us against them being the drill sergeants and all those other horrible people. But coming out of that, that's what worked, and that's what drove people, and you're quite right, and I underline that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your confirmation on that. always appreciate hearing from the lived experiences.
First of all, thank you so much for that lecture. It was really insightful and interesting. I wanted to ask you about your perspectives on the 100 days specifically. So you talk about how it's not as memorialized as much as it should be. Clearly, it's something that matters very much to you, and clearly it was impactful, both for the war and for Canadian history. So my question is, what are your perspectives on why it isn't as memorialized and celebrated as, for example, Vimy?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for your question and your comments. It's twofold, I would say, with the 100 days. The first is that, unlike Vimy and Passchendaele, the Ypres, where they're almost like, these are, battles, individual battles. The 100 days, it's like this long, drawn-out campaign, several battles. You can't really point to one commemorative date. It's not as neat in a commemorative structure. Vimy was easy. April 9th, Vimy Ridge, Battle of Vimy Ridge, very easy to brand, very easy to name. But then we talk about the 100 days. Well, then people bring up, Amiens. So I thought, is that in the 100 days? Like, they don't recognize the individual battles throughout the thread. So it's just tougher. Just for remembering, just for the layperson remembering it, it's tougher. And besides that, I think after the war, it was a little bit tarnished because it was such a period of suffering for the men. It was not remembered fondly in those early years. I mean, this was a time where, I'll show you the graph, but we sustained more casualties in 1918 than any other year. That includes 1917, Vimy, 70, Passchendaele. So I think just that it's almost tainted in a way, but the casualties were just so high. I think in those early years they just kind of wanted to forget that we got the war done, that's it. And I think it's a lot of the scholarship throughout the 20th century as well sort of focused on that static stalemate. That's the stereotype of the First World War. We think of the Somme, the Ypres, even the Passchendaels. 100 days is kind of like this, all right, it's this last few months and the war ends, but it doesn't get that same attention in the scholarship either. So that's sort of my multi-level answer, is that you can't really concentrate into one big battle that people can get behind and remember, and also kind of the tarnished legacy that it was such a high casualty rate, even though it was such an important campaign.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.